No resistance, no crime, just a black woman in a red dress, stopped in the street and scanned like cheap merchandise. Officer Brent Halverson laughed, pretended to check her car, then tossed her papers to the ground like trash. Cold eyes, disgust in his tone, acting like his badge gave him the right to humiliate anyone. But what he didn't know, she's a senior agent with the Department of the Interior. When her true identity is revealed, who's really in control and who's about to fall hard. Watch till the end to find out what happens when power meets someone it can't break. Brent Halverson pulled his patrol car up with a jolt, cutting across the quiet symmetry of the administrative district, without flashing lights, without sirens, and without a legitimate reason. The sun beat down like judgment, casting hard shadows across the broad sidewalk. But Brent's stare was harder. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just sat behind the wheel, chewing on the silence, letting it thicken until it meant something. Then he stepped out of his vehicle, boots hitting the pavement with a self-important thud, and approached her car like he owned the asphalt she was parked on. He didn't introduce himself, didn't ask for a license or registration. Instead, he planted himself in front of her hood and scanned her, not looked at, scanned from head to toe. His eyes were a slow-moving threat dragging across her skin like oil. "What's this? Headed to the National Black Empowerment Convention or something?" he said, voice laced with mockery and a smirk curling the side of his mouth, like he was proud of his venom. "Red dress, huh? Is that supposed to make you feel powerful?" His laugh was sharp, tinny. There was no humor in it, just the sound of someone used to barking without being bitten back. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Hands rested calmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Her posture was exact, not tense but not relaxed either, composed. A rhythm pulsed in her chest, slow and deliberate, like she was timing every breath to a song only she could hear. She didn't bother to meet his words with words. That would have given him the satisfaction of a response. She let the silence speak instead, and it echoed louder than anything he'd said so far. Grant smirked again, like her quiet was a joke he'd already heard. Then, without taking his eyes off her, he stepped to the front of her car and ran a hand across the hood, not brushing off dust or checking for damage, but marking territory. The touch was intimate in the most territorial way, fingers dragging across the metal with slow possessiveness. His hand paused in the center, splayed flat like he was feeling for the heartbeat of something he believed he controlled. The heat of the sun radiated off the hood, but he left his palm there an extra beat, as if to show he wasn't afraid to burn for the sake of dominance. She didn't move. Her eyes, framed by lashes that did not flicker, followed his movements without turning her head, watching, recording, breathing. That was all. But the longer she didn't react, the more obvious it became. This was not passivity. This was resistance in its purest, quietest form. Brent circled to the driver's side, boots cracking lightly on the sidewalk. He bent at the waist and knocked once on the window with the edge of his knuckle. A sharp, dismissive tap, the kind used for pests, not people. She rolled the window down exactly 3 centimeters. No more, no less. It stopped with a click that sounded like a line being drawn. He leaned in slightly, enough for her to smell the residue of cheap tobacco clinging to his breath. His eyes squinted, not from the sun, but from suspicion honed over years of making assumptions and calling it instinct. She reached forward, slow and deliberate, and held out the registration between her fingers, through the gap in the glass. She didn't look at him, didn't blink, just extended the paper like it was a formality in a scene she'd lived before. Brent took the paper without gratitude, holding it by the edge as if contact might contaminate him. He looked down, or at least pretended to. His fingers shifted slightly, as if about to read, but then, in one casual flick, he let the document fall. It fluttered once, landed on the curb with the weight of disregard. He didn't apologize, didn't explain. He smiled. His hand stayed on the car door frame longer than necessary. His fingers drummed once, an offbeat rhythm that said he was still in control. His eyes slid sideways toward hers again, searching for a crack, a twitch, a sign. that he had pierced the surface. But there was nothing, just that gaze even, anchored, not cold but calm in a way that unraveled him. Her eyes weren't afraid. They weren't angry. They were aware, and that awareness was the one thing he couldn't tolerate. He shifted on his heels, posture adjusting, recalibrating his tactic. Brent wasn't used to silence that bit back. Usually by now they'd be explaining, apologizing, pleading, but not her. Not this one. This one didn't give him anything to press against, and that made him uneasy. He looked at the paper lying on the sidewalk, still said nothing. Didn't pick it up. Instead, he leaned closer again, this time his face just inches from the small gap in the window. The way his shadow fell across her was no accident. He knew the effect of looming, and he used it like a tool. "Come on," he said, voice low but not soft. "Not even a smile? You people always have something to say. Where's that mouth now?" Her breathing didn't change, not faster, not slower. Her hands didn't shift on the wheel. Her gaze didn't leave his. That stillness, it wasn't passive, it was power held tight beneath skin. Brent stepped back slightly, blinking at the lack of reaction, and it bothered him more than he showed. He looked at the paper again, then away, pretending to scan something behind her, as if her presence wasn't the only thing dominating his focus. He moved one hand to his utility belt, resting near the radio like a casual threat, the hint of escalation just out of reach. "Is this your car?" he asked finally, though the question was a formality, not a real inquiry. He didn't wait for an answer. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you don't belong here." He paused, let the words linger, let them twist like smoke in the air. "You people always act like the law's a costume party, flashy clothes, fake respect, thinking we won't notice." Still, she didn't speak, not a syllable, not even a raised brow, just silence so heavy it made his voice sound foolish against it. He hated that. He hated the way she didn't flinch when he stepped closer, didn't shrink when he towered, didn't even purse her lips when he spat out his insults like they deserved applause. She reached for the paper, slowly, opened the door with deliberate weight, and stepped out just far enough to retrieve the document. Her movements were precise, almost surgical. She picked up the papers, straightened them with one clean tap against her palm, then slid them back into her bag without ever looking away from him. Then she sat back down, closed the door, put her hands back on the wheel. Same position, same breath, same silence. Brent stood there for a moment, staring at her through the glass like it had betrayed him somehow. His reflection caught in the window, a man with a badge, a sneer, and suddenly no leverage. He tapped the glass again, not as hard this time, less sure of himself. "You think you're better than this?" he asked, but the words hung limp in the air. He glanced over his shoulder as if looking for an audience that might still validate him, but the street was quiet, empty in all the wrong ways, so he shifted again. Posture more rigid now, like the uniform was the only thing keeping him from cracking. Her eyes didn't follow his movements anymore. She stared forward now, hands steady on the wheel, breathing slow and even, like she knew exactly what this was, like she'd seen it too many times to be shaken by the performance of it. And Brent, for the first time, looked unsure. He adjusted his belt, muttered something under his breath that didn't have enough venom to land, and took a step back, but not far, just enough to pace. He wasn't finished, but something inside him had started to fray, because control only matters when someone acknowledges it. And this woman, sitting silent, unmoved, unbroken, didn't give him the courtesy. She didn't need to speak to win this. That was the part he couldn't stand. The silence she wielded was not an absence of sound. It was a weapon sharpened by restraint, honed by centuries of being told to wait, to yield, to explain. She didn't grant him that indulgence. Her window stayed cracked exactly 3 centimeters, not for negotiation, not for fear, but as a measured line, a slit just wide enough for the transfer of a document and nothing else. Her fingers extended through the opening, holding out the vehicle registration with a steadiness that made the air feel dense. There was no tremble, no hesitation, just a clean offering of protocol, void of apology or performance. She gave him exactly what the law required, and not an inch more. Brent Halverson stared at the paper, then at her hand, then at the deliberate stillness wrapped around both. His lips curled in a sneer, the kind that needed no context. It was the sneer of a man whose authority had always been met with flinching, whose bark had always summoned reaction. But now, met with this silence, this woman who wouldn't flinch, his irritation curdled into something uglier. "Silent now?" he asked, cocking an eyebrow with a mock-surprised tone that didn't bother to hide its spite. "Or are you just practicing that civil rights mouthpiece tone? You know, the kind that usually comes with a megaphone and a lawsuit threat." His words were sharp, not because they were clever, but because they were forged in the lazy cruelty of someone who never had to work hard to be obeyed. She didn't blink. Her head didn't move. No raised brow, no sigh, just that same calm gaze meeting his, eyes like a polished lens that captured everything but reflected nothing. He didn't intimidate her, and more than that, he knew it. That realization crept beneath his skin like a rash. He leaned closer, arms braced on the top edge of the car door, his face pushing into the narrow space like smoke under a doorframe. His breath, sour with old tobacco and morning coffee, lingered between them. The heat of the street mingled with the heat of his breath, but she didn't recoil, she didn't even squint. "Where are you from?" he demanded, voice rough now, stripped of the mockery, searching for an anchor in his unraveling grip on the moment. "What are you doing here? Visiting someone? Trespassing, maybe? Trying to make a scene?" His tone tightened, laced with accusation dressed as inquiry, but it was all theater. He wasn't asking for answers. He was begging for control. Still, she didn't reply. No nod, no shake of the head, just presence, pure, unflinching presence. Her stillness was a mirror, and he couldn't bear to see himself in it. His nostrils flared as he stepped back half a pace, pacing once as if the motion could jog loose some power he'd lost. He gripped his radio, fingers twitching slightly. She watched him without turning her head. It wasn't defiance, it was the diagnosis. She was diagnosing his unraveling, watching the slow collapse of a man who thought he was the architect of every room he entered, and now found himself out of blueprints. He clicked the button on the radio, pressed it to his lips like it might steady him. "Unit 4, this is Halverson. I've got a possible administrative breach. Black female, early 30s, not cooperating with verbal protocol, requesting a secondary vehicle for assistance, possible infiltration, district access unclear." The words sounded official, bureaucratic, and even, but underneath they trembled with the fear of irrelevance. She heard every syllable, but gave no reaction, not even a flick of the eye, no defensiveness, no urgency, only the same quiet posture, hand back on the wheel now, eyes forward, as if his words couldn't touch her, because they had never truly been aimed at her. They were a performance, and she refused to be an audience. Brent stepped away again, rolling his shoulders as if to shake something off. His face was taut, no longer amused, his jaw clenched and unclenched like a metronome of frustration. He hadn't expected this. People like her, alone, dressed sharp, driving clean, they usually explained themselves by now, over-explained even, just to avoid the tangle of confrontation. But not her. She sat behind the glass like a monolith, unmoved, unbothered, and most unforgivably, untouchable. He glanced down the block, hoping to see the second patrol car pull up, hoping for a witness to validate his slipping grasp, but the street remained hushed, wrapped in the mid-morning heat. His eyes darted back to her, now searching not for guilt but for anything human, fear, annoyance, discomfort, but there was none. She didn't give him anything to work with, and in that void, he flailed. The radio on his hip buzzed once with static, and he pressed it again, barking half-formed codes into the void. She remained still. He leaned forward one more time, voice lower now. Not out of discretion, but desperation. "You think silence makes you better than this? Better than me?" he asked, though his tone betrayed the truth. He already believed she was. No answer. And it was that refusal, that resolute nothingness, that shook him most. He stepped back again, suddenly unsure of his hands, unsure of his posture, unsure if the uniform still fit the way it used to. He was a man built on volume and intimidation, and now both were dissolving in front of a woman who never raised her voice, never moved, never gave him anything but the weight of her presence. And for Brent Halverson, that silence was not absence, it was judgment. It was an indictment. It was the sound of every unchecked abuse he'd ever whispered behind a badge, echoing back at him through 3 centimeters of open glass. He turned on his heel, not in retreat but in stalling, pretending to check his surroundings again, pretending to still hold the reins. But in that moment, even the asphalt seemed to resist him, no longer bending beneath the boots he used to trust. Her car remained still, her gaze as unwavering. Her body language said one thing only: "I'm not here to flinch. I'm here to watch you fail." And though no one spoke it aloud, it was clear who held the power now. It wasn't the man with the badge. It was the woman who didn't need to speak to command the entire street. The silence had begun to wrap around Brent like a net, tightening, invisible, impossible to shake off. And just as the weight of her wordless defiance grew too large to ignore, the soft, familiar chime of a phone recording broke the stillness. It came from across the street, from the hand of a young man who had paused mid-step, thumb hovering over a screen, now pointed squarely at the scene unfolding. His expression was neutral, but the camera lens was a quiet revolution. Brent saw it. He saw the way the boy stood, steady and unflinching, and something primal flickered in his gaze. Discomfort, dressed as disdain. But Brent didn't back off. No, he raised his voice like a shield, volume wrapped in arrogance. "Good," he barked, voice pitched higher, sharp like cracked glass. "More witnesses, let's make it a show. You want to play audience? Be my guest." He spat the words toward the boy across the street, but his eyes didn't leave the woman in the red dress. She was still silent, still steady. Her hands hadn't moved. Her gaze hadn't flickered. But now, the game had changed. The presence of the camera didn't rattle her, it refined her. The silence took on a new tone. No longer a private protest, but a public performance, not for attention, not for spectacle, for evidence, for truth. Her stillness wasn't passive anymore. It was prosecutorial. Brent, sensing the shift but refusing to acknowledge it, reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his phone. The movement was swift, performative, and theatrical. "You think I'm afraid to be recorded," he said with a sneer, thumbing open the camera app. "I'll show them what happens when someone refuses lawful orders. I'll show them what aggression looks like dressed up in silence." He lifted the phone and aimed it at her face. "Smile for the camera," he added, his voice dipped in sarcasm and smugness. The screen glowed as he began to record. "This is Officer Brent Halverson, documenting the subject's hostile, non-cooperative behavior during a traffic stop. The subject is refusing to communicate, possible concealment of identity, possible evasion of administrative regulation." His voice had shifted into something rehearsed, a brittle mimicry of protocol meant to mask his unraveling. But every word he spoke only drew a sharper contrast to her stillness. She turned her head slowly, deliberately, to meet the camera. Her face was expressionless, but not empty. It was full of knowing. Her eyes did not blink. Her mouth did not twitch. She didn't posture. She didn't hide. She simply looked. And in that look was the indictment of 1,000 silent stories untold, all condensed into the sharp, unwavering line of her gaze. She wasn't performing, she was witnessing. And Brent's words, his bravado, his badge, became smaller with every second the lens captured her composure against his chaos. He moved closer to her car again, camera in hand, angling to catch more of her profile. His shadow crept across the door, long and ugly under the midday sun. "You don't have anything to say for yourself?" he pressed, voice rising. "Not a single word? Not even a damn thank you for not dragging you out of this car already?" His laugh came quickly and dry, humorless. Or is silence the new civil disobedience now? Still nothing, not even a breath that betrayed emotion. But her right hand shifted ever so slightly, barely perceptible. It moved to rest lightly on her bag. Her fingers curled along the edge of the leather strap. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was precision. A subtle shift in posture, not meant for him, not meant for the camera, but for herself. It was the movement of someone who knew exactly where everything she needed was, and exactly what to do if pushed further. Brent noticed. He paused mid-word, mouth slightly open, phone still raised. That hand on the bag, it spoke louder than any declaration, and for a moment, just a moment, he hesitated. He recalculated. He cleared his throat, tried to recover, and tried to rebuild the mask. "You see that?" he said, turning half to the camera in his hand. "That's a threat. Reaching for a bag like that in front of an officer during an official traffic interaction, clear non-compliance." He was narrating now, to the phone, to the street, to himself. "She's escalating. I'm documenting everything for the record." But his voice had started to stretch thin. The confidence cracked at the edges, unraveling in the light of his desperation. Across the street, the boy with the phone didn't move, still recording, still silent. Brent's voice echoed strangely now, bouncing back at him from the glass of her window, from the screen of his phone, from the eyes of a woman who hadn't said a single word but had already dismantled his authority, piece by crumbling piece. She continued to look at him. No hatred, no pity, just awareness. Her silence was no longer just defiance, it was diagnosis. She saw him. She saw the performance, the panic disguised as protocol, the hunger for dominance struggling under the weight of exposure, and she offered him nothing in return. No relief, no escalation, just the presence of someone who had already decided she would not be moved by anything he said or did. He lowered the phone, hand trembling slightly now, fingers unsure whether to grip or release. The silence around them had turned into a stage, and Brent, for all his noise, had become the only one still pretending this was about procedure. He stepped back from the car again, but the distance didn't change anything. Her gaze followed, unbroken. Her breath was still slow, her hand still resting on the bag, not clenched, not shaking, just red. The street seemed quieter now, as if even the city paused to watch the unraveling. A car passed in the distance, indifferent. A bird landed on a lamppost and flew away again. But at the center of the scene, Brent stood, and for all his training, all his threats, all his titles and tools and tactics, he was the one exposed. He glanced at his phone screen, saw his face reflected, saw the sweat starting to gather along his temple, saw the woman behind the glass unmoved. His eyes darted to the boy across the street, then back to her, then to the phone in his hand. Every angle reminded him of how thoroughly outmatched he was by a woman who hadn't yet spoken. The weight of that realization pressed on his chest like gravity made personal. She didn't shift again. Her stillness remained perfect, brutal in its simplicity, and it spoke volumes. Not every confrontation explodes with noise. Some bury you beneath silence so thick you can't breathe. And Brent Halverson, with his badge and his bark and his brittle pride, was already drowning in it. The silence was now unbearable for him, yet she wore it like armor, impenetrable, polished and intentional. Brent stood outside her car. The thick tension between them stretched to its limit, tight as glass just before it shatters. His jaw twitched once. His fingers flexed in frustration. Then, with a slow and almost delicate motion, he lifted one hand and knocked once, twice, on her window with the tip of his index finger. It wasn't a knock meant to get attention. It was sharper, smaller, and cruel in its precision. A tap just light enough to feel, beneath notice, but loud enough to sting. It was the gesture of a man convinced he still held control, who believed the power of his presence was enough to compel submission. The sound of knuckle meeting glass wasn't loud, but it pierced the moment with unmistakable malice. Brent's mouth twisted into a mockery of a smile, the kind that never reached the eyes, the kind designed to slice. He leaned in closer, forehead nearly brushing the edge of the driver's side window, voice low and acid-soaked. "People like you," he said, each word coated in disdain, "should learn to communicate better. Know your place. It's a lot less humiliating than being cuffed in the middle of a public sidewalk." He let the sentence linger like a blade just barely grazing the skin, hoping she'd wince. She didn't. Instead, with the calm of someone who had already measured the consequences and found them lacking, she reached for the control and began to lower the window. The motor hummed softly as the glass descended, not in haste, not in panic, but like a curtain being drawn for a performance she had already rehearsed. It stopped at the halfway point, enough to meet him, enough to confront. Her eyes lifted and locked with his. They weren't angry, they weren't afraid. They were observational, like she was studying something under a microscope, cataloging flaws, measuring weakness, watching rot expand in real time. Brent flinched. Barely, but it was there. A fractional recoil, the instinct of a man who suddenly felt too seen. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The act of lowering the window was not submission. It was an invitation, daring him to say more, to try more, to reveal just how far he was willing to go. Then, with the same calm deliberation, she raised the glass again. Her fingers tapped the button with finality. The pane slid upward with a clean click, sealing him back outside the perimeter of her patience. He chuckled, a short, ugly sound that felt more like a threat than amusement. "Oh, so now you're mocking law enforcement?" he said, louder now, voice rising to fill the space the glass had shut off. "You think that's going to play well on camera? That silence makes you superior? That your costume gives you power?" His words were becoming unhinged, fraying at the edges as he tried to dress them in authority. But all she gave him in return was stillness. She tilted her head slightly, just enough to suggest she was considering his words. Not because they held truth, but because she was filing them away. Her breath deepened once, slow and controlled, like she was etching his threats into memory. Her hands remained steady. Her posture never shifted. The calm was surgical. And then, without ceremony, she moved one hand to the lock inside the door. She didn't press it. She didn't flip it shut. She simply let her fingers rest there, lightly touching the mechanism. The message was unmistakable. She didn't need to lock him out. He was already out. But she wanted him to know she had the option. She wanted him to understand the line had been drawn. Brent noticed the gesture instantly. His eyes darted to her fingers, then back to her face. There was no movement from her, no twitch, no blink, just that hand resting like a quiet warning. It wasn't defense, it was a statement. He was no longer a man making demands, he was a threat being managed. He straightened up, the smugness in his posture starting to unravel. The weight of the moment, the presence of the cameras, the heat of the street, the unforgiving mirror of her silence began to press in on him. His voice, when he spoke again, cracked slightly. "This is how it's going to be? You think this little act of yours is going to hold up when you're in front of a judge? When they ask why you refused a lawful instruction?" He was scrambling now, fishing for footing in the quicksand of her composure, but she didn't respond. Her eyes didn't leave his. The silence between them had taken on shape, had become a wall, a weapon, a verdict. Her gaze said it all. She was not his defendant. She was his consequence. The car was a fortress now, the glass a border more meaningful than any badge. On one side stood a man unraveling, his voice louder with every inch of his power slipping. On the other side sat a woman who had given him nothing, no outrage, no panic, no words to twist, and in that she had given him everything he feared. She had made him irrelevant. He exhaled sharply, stepping back again, rubbing the bridge of his nose like it was her silence giving him a headache. His knuckles tapped once more on the glass, softer now, less certain. Not an insult this time, just a reflex. But the line had been drawn. The window was the barrier, her stillness the gatekeeper. And Brent Halverson, for all his noise and title and bark, was left pounding on glass that no longer opened for him. Because there are moments when power is not screamed, it is withheld, and in that quiet a new truth rises. One not wrapped in a badge, but in the choice to remain calm when chaos demands reaction. And she, in that red dress, had chosen. The silence had calcified into a wall, and behind it she sat steady and unfazed, while Brent paced outside like a man watching his leash get shorter. But then, with a movement so smooth it sliced through the tension like a razor through silk, she reached for the handle. No warning, no signal. The door clicked and swung open, and for the first time, Brent took a step back. She stood up slowly. The red dress caught the sun and refracted it like polished glass, shimmering not in decoration, but declaration. Her posture was upright, her movement precise, like someone exiting a vehicle and more like someone stepping onto a stage where the verdict had already been written. Her heels struck the pavement with purpose, and the sound echoed not loud but deep, as if the street itself registered the shift in balance. Brent's eyes widened, not in fear yet, but in confusion. He hadn't anticipated this. His grip on the moment, which had already been unraveling, now slipped completely through his fingers. He opened his mouth to speak, some half-formed insult or authority flex, but she was already moving. She reached into her bag. The motion was clean, deliberate, no fumble, no search. She knew exactly where the item was, and when her hand emerged, it carried a badge, gold-rimmed, sealed in blue, the emblem of internal affairs glinting like a blade in the sunlight. She raised it, not slowly, not dramatically, but with the precision of a final move in a game already won. Her arm extended in a single line, direct, unwavering, and she held it exactly at Bren's eye level. "Recording enough yet?" she asked. Voice low, almost gentle, but sharpened to a lethal edge. The words struck harder than a shout. They didn't need volume. They needed only presence. And Brent froze. His entire body seemed to glitch. His hands, which just seconds ago had hovered confidently near his belt, dropped to his sides, as if the bones inside had turned to dust. His mouth opened, then closed, jaw working but producing no sound. He stared at the badge like it was an execution order, and in some ways it was, not of his body, but of his illusion of control. She didn't lower the badge, she didn't flinch or blink. Her expression remained unreadable, her gaze locked directly on him. She didn't gloat. That would have been too easy, too small. Instead, she stepped forward. Just one step, but it brought her face to face with him. No glass, no window, no barrier, and now there was no distance between them but breath. Brent's shoulders twitched, as if they'd forgotten how to carry weight. She leaned in just slightly, voice reduced now to a whisper, but not one born of secrecy. It was the whisper of a scalpel before the cut. "You played your role well," she said, eyes unblinking. "Didn't even need coaching. Just pointed the camera and your nature did the rest." He blinked, once, twice, but still said nothing. The badge still hung in the air between them, a silent line he could never uncross. There were no theatrics, no grand monologue, no sirens to underscore the moment, just a woman in red, badge in hand, truth in her voice, and a man undone, not by force but by exposure. And for Brent Halverson, that was the real punishment, being seen. The words she had whispered were still hanging in the air, razor-sharp and clean, but it wasn't the sound of them that unsettled the street. It was what followed, nothing. Brent Halverson did not respond. He didn't argue. He didn't retreat. He simply stood there, suspended in place as if time itself had congealed around him. The badge she held still hovered between them like a verdict made flesh, glowing gold and blue under the sun that now felt far too distant for midday. It took exactly 4 more seconds for the silence to stretch from moment to monument. Across the street, the young man with the phone had stopped pretending to record discreetly. His hand was still, screen perfectly level, the red dot blinking in the corner. But he wasn't filming a police stop anymore. He was capturing a collapse. The live stream kicked in, no commentary, no movement, just the lens witnessing the unraveling of a uniform that had believed itself untouchable. No one laughed. No one made a sound. Even the breeze had softened, as if nature itself respected the finality of what was being undone. Brent's hands twitched once, fingers curling toward the radio clipped to his chest like a drowning man reaching for air. But he hesitated. The gesture lacked conviction. His hand hovered near the device, unsure whether to grip it or let it hang limp. She did not move. She did not blink. The badge remained in her hand for a moment longer, held not as a threat, but as truth. Then, as if she'd decided that enough had been said without ever raising her voice, she slid the badge back into her bag. The motion was precise, efficient, no drama, just closure. "You no longer have jurisdiction here," she said, her voice even, without a trace of performance. The words struck with the weight of law, but also something heavier. Truth, long suppressed, now exposed without apology. Brent's eyes flicked toward her face, then away, then back. He couldn't hold her gaze. It burned without fire. His hand, still hovering, finally touched the radio. A weak instinct for protocol, a last gasp of relevance. But before he could press the button, her voice cut through the stillness again, soft, but definitive. "The local precinct was alerted 3 minutes ago," she said. "You've been expected." Her tone held no threat, only certainty, and that certainty was colder than any shout could have been. Brent froze again. His fingers retreated from the radio like they'd been burned. For a man who had spent years relying on his belt, his badge, his bark, the emptiness around him now screamed louder than any siren. There was no backup coming to save face, no supervisor to spin the story, no citizen is too scared to speak, only a badge, a live stream, and a woman who had reduced his authority to dust without laying a hand on him. He glanced down at his hip, the sidearm now feeling more like a weight than a weapon. His body didn't reach for it. There was no point. There was nothing left between his hand and that gun. No justification, no threat, no escalation that could be rationalized. She hadn't even raised her voice. That was the final blow. And still, she stared, not with hatred, not with pity, just stillness, solid, anchored, inevitable. Her presence was not a reaction, it was a reckoning. Behind her, the young man with the phone kept streaming. The digital world began to fill with viewers, but no one watching would hear gunshots, or shouts, or slurs. They would witness the quiet toppling of a structure built on noise. And Brent Halverson, badge number 6481, Precinct 9, stood frozen in the middle of the administrative district, bathed in sunlight he could no longer weaponize, and knew, finally, that he was no longer the man in control. She never needed to raise her hand. She only needed to stand still. The air was still thick with the quiet Brent couldn't break, the kind of quiet that didn't come from peace, but from precision. Every second he stood there in uniform felt heavier, his authority evaporating with the weight of each breath. She didn't waste on him, but the silence didn't last much longer. She shifted, slowly, and opened her bag once more. This time, it wasn't the badge, it was paper, a document wrapped not in drama but in the cold efficiency of policy. She held it like a judge holds a sentence, unmoved, inevitable, and final. She unfolded the document with care, her fingers unhurried. Then, without raising her voice or asking permission, she read, "This is a federal internal oversight directive. Under Section 47A, Officer Brent Halverson, badge number 6481, is hereby suspended from duty, effective immediately, pending a formal ethics review and use of authority investigation." Her tone was exact. Every syllable fell like a stamp, like a signature on something that couldn't be undone. She didn't rush. She didn't pause for effect. She read like the truth didn't need help to land hard. Brent blinked hard, his lips parting to offer resistance, but what came out was frail, a reflex more than a defense. "I was performing a lawful stop," he muttered. His voice lacked the venom he once had, the smug certainty. Now it just sounded hollow, rehearsed, weak. She looked up from the document, her eyes meeting his with no amusement and no pity. "And I am performing federal oversight," she said flatly, "at a level you're unfamiliar with." Her tone was still calm. No pitch increase, no shift in pace, but somehow it landed like an anvil. Brent opened his mouth again, but she turned away before he could form another excuse. Her attention moved to the young man with the phone, who had kept filming without a word. His hand was steady, his face tense but locked in focus. She nodded once toward him. "Keep live streaming," she said. It wasn't a request, it was a command cloaked in simplicity, and he obeyed. There was no doubt in her voice, no insecurity, just the presence of someone who was no longer playing along with the pageantry of old power structures. Then, she turned back to Brent, who was standing half in shadow now, like the street itself had already begun to disown him. "Everything deserves light," she said, her voice even and deliberate, especially the things darkness tries to dress in a badge. The sentence wasn't long, but it cut deeper than anything he had heard all day, not because it was loud, but because it was true. He didn't argue again. His body language sagged, shoulders dipped, eyes blinked without focus, and she, without raising a hand or a shout, had removed him from power. Her voice had done what handcuffs never could. It had rendered him exposed, and in that exposure, the uniform meant nothing. The badge meant less. She didn't celebrate. She didn't need to. The verdict had already been spoken. The sound of her verdict still echoed, not in decibels, but in consequence. Brent stood where she'd left him, stripped of authority and voice, suspended more by the silence around him than any official paper. But the ripple had already begun to move beyond the sidewalk, past the recording phone, past the bystanders, straight toward the building that had created him. Inside the station, fluorescent lights buzzed low over paperwork and procedural boredom. In the glass-walled conference room, the precinct captain leaned forward in his chair mid-sentence until the vibration in his pocket severed the meeting's flow. He glanced at the screen, then blinked twice, the way a man does when seeing something that doesn't compute. The header of the email wasn't coded or polite. It was loud in its language. Priority, level, oversight, trigger, subject, officer, Brent Halverson. Initiate protocol. 3. International response immediate. He didn't finish his sentence. The meeting stopped. Conversations evaporated. He stood abruptly, lips parted, and without a word walked toward his office as if gravity itself had changed weight. Behind that closed door, his fingers moved fast across a keyboard. Eyes scanned the attached directives. Department of Justice seal. Oversight Division watermark. Time-stamped 34 minutes ago. Level 3 internal escalation. The kind that usually followed an indictment, not a live traffic stop. And there it was in black text. Halverson, primary target, field suspension, executed by federal authority. Outside the station, the phones hadn't started ringing yet. The public didn't know, but the system did. It always did. Brandt's name was already entered into an administrative freeze, badge authorization revoked, internal affairs access override approved. The building that once protected him now pulsed cold around his digital presence like a firewall collapsing inward. Brent, still standing beside the patrol car that had become more cage than vessel, reached into his radio pocket, thumb trembling as he pressed the familiar button and raised it to his mouth. His voice had none of the clipped aggression from earlier, none of the assumed confidence. "Dispatch, this is Officer Halverson. I need to speak to command," he muttered. He sounded like he was waking from a dream he didn't control anymore. On the other end, there was a pause, longer than protocol. Then, a click. Static broke. A voice came through. Female, precise, unrushed. "This line is under temporary reassignment," she said. No emotion, no malice. Just administration in its purest form. Brent froze. That voice, it was her. He stared at the radio in his hand, as if it had betrayed him. She continued, as calm as reading the weather, "You've reached an active oversight channel. We are currently monitoring a subject exhibiting potential abuse of authority and jurisdictional overreach. Please hold for further instructions." There was no need to say his name, no need to explain. The tone, the words, the cold weight behind every syllable made it clear he was no longer the one calling the shots. She was no longer on the sidewalk. She was in his system, on his channel, speaking through the tools he once thought belonged to him. He didn't speak again. He lowered the radio, the sound of his shallow breath now the loudest thing in his ears. His eyes darted to the squad car as if hoping it might still carry some vestige of power. It didn't. It was just a vehicle, a steel box. He stood next to it now like a man ejected from his mythology. And somewhere in the command office, the captain rubbed his temple and cursed under his breath. Not because the system had failed, but because, for once, it had done exactly what it was supposed to. Too fast, too clean, and aimed at one of their own. Brandt's fall wasn't private anymore. It was federal. The fallout had moved quickly, wrapping itself around Brent like a second skin he couldn't shed. Now he sat under artificial lighting, hands folded but restless, inside a room that looked sterile by design, every corner sharpened by procedure. The walls didn't need color. They had authority, and behind him, mounted clean and unblinking on the back wall, the seal of the Department of Internal Affairs stared down like a silent verdict. It didn't blink. It didn't budge, just like the woman seated across from him. She was still. Her composure wasn't a show. It was her signature. The same implacable calm that had dismantled his presence on the street now anchored her at the table, clipboard beside her, eyes steady, voice unreadable. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was strategic. Brent squirmed in it. He cleared his throat, tapped his fingers against his palm, and blinked too often. But she waited. Not to intimidate, not to punish. To document. "Officer Brent Halverson," she said, the words crisp but without affect. "Please recount your actions and exact statements from the incident earlier today." Her tone was not accusatory. It didn't need to be. It was institutional, the kind of voice built to reduce defensiveness to data, ego to entry. Brent opened his mouth, but his tongue fumbled over the start. I was conducting a routine traffic stop," he began, eyes darting between her face and the microphone recording every word. "The vehicle appeared to be, possibly, involved in a misclassification, and the subject wasn't compliant." She raised a hand, not to interrupt, but to pause him. Her other hand reached into a slim folder and withdrew a single sheet. A button on the table was pressed. A recording played. His voice, unmistakable, filled the room with the venom he could no longer mask. "Red dress, huh? Is that supposed to make you feel powerful?" Then another, "People like you should learn to communicate." And the fatal one, "We don't cast roles like that for your type." Each sentence dropped like lead, factual and unflinching. Not allegations. Recordings. Time-stamped. Archived. Streamed. Immutable. He stopped the audio, folded her hands again, and looked directly at him. "Those are your words. Not paraphrased, not alleged. Recorded in full. Would you like to amend your statement before we continue?" Her tone didn't suggest emotion. It didn't need to. The language of evidence had already spoken. Brent shifted in his seat, his mouth opening again, this time slower, his voice smaller. I may have..." He trailed off, blinked again, searching the corners of the room as if a version of himself that hadn't said those things might appear and save him. "Context," he said finally, like it was a lifeboat. "There was a lack of cooperation." She refused to speak. "That creates uncertainty." She tilted her head slightly, not as a challenge, but as a calculation. "Silence does not constitute aggression," she replied. "And uniform does not authorize prejudice." Another document slid across the table, a signed transmittal of civilian footage, paired with GPS tags and a transcript. "You weren't uncertain, officer. You were entitled, and you exercised that entitlement as if it were law." He didn't respond. He didn't reach for the document. She leaned forward just enough to re-anchor her authority, but not to intimidate. "You chose the wrong target," she said, voice low but absolute. "But I did not choose the wrong moment." Her eyes locked on his, not with anger, but with finality. There was nothing left to say, only facts, and facts don't flinch. The silence that Brent once wielded like a baton now wrapped itself around him like a noose. He sat under the sterile lights of the internal review chamber, face drained, spine folding inward like paper left out in the rain. The room smelled of antiseptic and consequence. Across from him she sat still, impossibly composed, as if the weight of what was about to happen could not graze her, only sharpen her. Behind her, the official seal of the Department of Internal Affairs cast a long, silent shadow on the glass wall, flanked by a digital screen that had not yet come to life. But he knew it would, and when it did, it would not show rumors or speculation. It would show the truth, in resolution as too high to refute. He didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. Everything about her posture, the calm gravity in her breath, the faint glint of the badge clipped beside her case file, told the room she was no longer reacting, she was reporting. The board behind the glass had taken their seats. The red recording light on the table flickered on. Then she tapped the remote once, and the screen behind her hummed. The past exploded into color. Names, faces, internal incident reports, time-stamped complaints, official seals, dismissals, redactions, footnotes with missing pages, PDF files from years ago, the kind of digital clutter that lazy officers trusted would bury itself with time. But this screen didn't blink. It recalled, one report at a time. Every file Brent had hoped would stay buried marched back into the light, unforgiving, chronological, and damning. He turned slightly toward the screen, not to read it, but to let him see it in full. She wanted him to feel it. Every name that appeared wasn't just a complaint, it was a reckoning. 5 incidents, she said, her voice as cold as it was clear. 3 were dismissed under insufficient evidence. 2 were redirected by procedural transfers. 0 disciplinary actions. A pattern. Her words hit like clean blades. Precise, not theatrical. Her language was not that of rage. It was a regulation. It was code, clause, and footnote. It was everything the system had taught her to memorize, and everything Brent had assumed she'd never use. He shifted in his chair, neck stiff, the corners of his mouth twitching in an involuntary grimace, but she wasn't done. Another tap. The screen changed again. A career map. Arrows, colored dots, and red-circled dates marked his trajectory through departments. She stood now, calmly, pointer in hand. Here, May 2018, internal complaint, alleged use of unnecessary force during a nighttime stop. She pointed again. August 2019, a second complaint. Verbal misconduct during processing. No follow-up action. Same supervisor. She clicked once more. November 2021. Reassigned. No record of review. Her voice didn't rise. It lowered. Each word is heavier than the last. She was not trying to provoke him. She was laying the track for his fall. Brent looked up at the screen and then down again. His eyes avoided hers now, the same way criminals avoid mirrors. His fingers flexed against the metal edge of the table as if trying to grasp something. Control, maybe, or at least a piece of narrative to hold on to. But it was gone. She didn't give him space to retreat. She tapped again. A confidential memo opened, signed by a junior analyst now retired. The memo warned of a discernible behavioral pattern requiring supervisory attention. It had been marked unconfirmed. It had been archived without action. Her eyes met his again. You weren't ignored because they didn't see it, she said. You were protected because they chose not to. Brent opened his mouth. No sound came. She continued. You know what's more dangerous than corruption, Officer Halverson? She asked, still standing. Apathy. And this department wrapped your actions in so much apathy you believed they made you untouchable. The screen changed again. A highlighted excerpt appeared, taken from his performance evaluation. It praised his assertive field instincts and effective command presence. She read it aloud, slowly, letting the hypocrisy code every syllable. Effective command presence. Then she stepped back and let the silence answer for him. This was not cross-examination. This was an autopsy. To be continued. Brent didn't lift his head. His eyes remained glued to the stainless steel table, a reflection of overhead light splitting across his cheekbones like a surgical cut. He looked smaller now, as if the uniform on his back no longer fit. The air between them, once filled with the false confidence of his rank, had gone dense, heavier with every click of her remote. She sat again, posture unshaken, and tapped once more. A new screen unfolded. A digital audit of internal communications and login histories. Dates and times, usernames and deletions. This, she said, is from June 14th, 2020, 2:17 a.m. The screen showed a request to archive a civilian complaint. submitted under Brent's credentials. Complaint 4A7912, filed by a 26-year-old woman, was later deemed inconclusive due to insufficient evidence. She paused. Except that the evidence was never reviewed. Another tab. Here's your system log. Request to delete audio footage, time-stamped 41 minutes, after the complaint was received. The file was never recovered. Brent's hands tightened around the lip of the table. His mouth opened as if to protest, but his throat caught the words mid-air. There was nothing left to explain. She didn't look for justification. Her job wasn't to debate him, it was to document him. The woman who filed that report moved to another state, changed her number, changed her name, she continued, voice even. I called her last week. Brent flinched. She didn't miss it. She cried. She didn't cry because she remembered what you did. She cried because she didn't think anyone would ever ask. He said nothing. She turned back to the screen. Let's review your transfers, she continued. A new slide opened. A map. 2 departmental relocations, each within 60 days of a flagged review. Each was accompanied by internal emails from superiors noting that you may require a cooling-off period. She looked at him again. You weren't being disciplined, you were being hidden. She slid another document across the table. This one printed. It was a scan of an unsigned disciplinary recommendation. Handwritten notes scribbled in the margins. Her finger tapped on a line. Quote, he's too aggressive in public contact, should be reassigned to avoid legal exposure. That's from your former sergeant. He retired with a full pension. He never filed the final version. She slid the paper back toward herself. We found it in his archived files, slipped behind a memo on supply budgeting. Brent's face had gone pale, the color draining like ink from overused paper. His fingers now laced together, knuckles rigid. Still, he said nothing. She let the silence linger. Let it wrap around them like truth always does when it's been denied for too long. Then the screen dimmed and was replaced by a grid of faces. Not names, not files, faces. All of them are victims, all of them blurred in news reports, ignored by case reviews, silenced by red tape. But here, now, they stared back. Proof, not in theory, but in consequence. She spoke again, not loudly, but like a verdict being read. 5 documented incidents. 3 suppressed. 2 reassigned. 1 career was constructed over the belief that no one would ever check. He finally looked up. Her voice didn't change, didn't waver, but someone did. Brent sat, as though buried beneath the very weight of the faces on the screen. They didn't blink. They didn't accuse. They didn't need to. Their presence, projected and undeniable, spoke of a truth long denied and perfectly preserved. The soft whir of the monitor was the only sound in the room, and it pulsed like a second heartbeat beneath the silence. His breaths had turned shallow, controlled, calculated. But they couldn't conceal the erosion of whatever shield he thought remained. She waited just long enough, then spoke again. Slow, precise, with a tone that could make a paper cut feel like an incision. You think today is about you. Her voice was calm, legal, not personal. But this room isn't about your fall. It's about what stood behind you, what let you rise. The screen changed. This time, the data wasn't about Brent. It was about the system, about every supervisor who let his misconduct slide to preserve the precinct's image, about every unsigned recommendation, every incident closed with the phrase, no pattern of behavior established, about the HR reports marked flagged for review and then never reviewed. A timeline spread across the screen, red lines connecting missed accountability to continued promotion. The names of other officers appeared, then vanished. They were not targets today, but they were not innocent either. They were context. And context is what makes culture. She pointed. Here, November 2017. Your first internal complaint. Verbal assault during a residential disturbance call. The report disappeared from the system within 48 hours. No record of who deleted it. But the chain of custody shows access from 3 accounts. 1 belonged to your precinct commander. 1 belonged to legal counsel. The third, your own. Brent's jaw tightened. His mouth opened slightly as if to object, but she cut him off, not with volume, but with pace. "Don't bother," she said. "We confirmed it. The metadata doesn't lie." A beat passed. Then another report loaded. This one wasn't about the victims. It was a psychological evaluation, his own, taken during his 3rd year of service after an off-duty altercation in a parking lot. Recommended counseling for aggression and unresolved authority fixation, she read aloud. Deemed not critical. Flag removed at supervisor's discretion. She folded the paper carefully and placed it aside. "This department," she continued, "looked you in the eye and chose not to blink." Brent exhaled, slow and heavy. She leaned forward slightly, closing the space between her voice and his shame. "That's why I'm here. Not because of what you did, but because they let you do it. Over and over." The screen dimmed again. Now it showed a single sentence. White letters on black. "Lack of follow-up is not a lack of knowledge." She paused, then spoke. "You didn't just act in darkness. You were handed the flashlight, told where to point it, and trusted not to aim it at the wrong people. But you did, repeatedly, because you believed the light belonged to you." Brent's hands were flat on the table, palms down. Still, he didn't argue, he didn't speak. The foundation beneath him had shifted. This wasn't a fall anymore, it was an excavation. "To be clear," she said, locking eyes with him now, "I am not just here as an individual. I'm here as a consequence. I'm here because someone in this system finally said, 'Enough.'" And when she leaned back, the screen stayed on. Because the system that had protected him wasn't just under investigation, it was under oath. The silence that returned now wasn't the kind Brent had once used to dominate a room. This was a different kind of silence. Dense. Judicial, final. It didn't ask for space, it took it. The screen still glowed behind her, its last message unwavering. Lack of follow-up is not lack of knowledge. Brent stared at it, not because he hoped it would change, but because he knew it never would. That sentence wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had held the clipboard, signed the form, silenced the voice, and moved on. He had been their instrument, their shield, and now he was their liability. She rose slowly, not with ceremony, but with command, gathering the final documents as if collecting scalpel tools after a finished procedure. Brent shifted slightly in his chair, but he didn't speak. His voice had been useful when he was giving orders. Now it would only incriminate. Across the room, behind a double-glass partition, the review board sat still, suits tight across their shoulders, expressions unreadable, pens still but ready. The verdict wasn't to be decided today, but the truth already had been. She faced Brent one last time. "This isn't just about what you did," she said, her tone measured, every syllable calibrated like evidence in a closing argument. "It's about how long everyone let you do it." Her voice didn't rise, it didn't tremble, but it carried the weight of institutional memory, the kind that doesn't disappear when the uniform comes off. She took a step closer, not to intimidate, but to remove distance from the final cut. "You built your career on the assumption no one would remember, that no one would care enough to ask the second question. But today, Officer Halverson, your assumptions expired." His eyes flickered up, jaw tight, lips parted like a man about to object, but no sound came. She tapped once on the table. The audio recording system beeped softly. "For the record," she said, "the subject was given full opportunity to respond. No substantive defense was provided." She closed the case file. "All statements will be submitted to the Federal Review Committee. Further recommendations pending." She turned, walked toward the exit, and paused just before the threshold. Then she said the line that would replay on news broadcasts, in lectures, on every whistleblower case study for a decade to come. "You thought I was just another citizen. That's your last mistake." And then she left. No slamming door, no applause, just the sound of her heels fading down the hall. And Brent, still seated, left behind in the heatless light of an institution that finally remembered what it had tried to forget. The walls were too smooth, too silent. No clocks were ticking, no vents humming, no casual echoes to hide behind. Brent Halverson shifted in his seat, the synthetic leather protesting with a soft creak. the only sound he could still control. She stood at the threshold for a moment, then stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and did not sit. Her presence filled the room more completely than noise ever could. He glanced up, offered a tight, brittle smile. "Thanks for agreeing to this. Just wanted a moment away from the lights, the panel, the performance." His voice reached for casual, but came back hollow. "We both know how showy those sessions can get." She said nothing. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, posture open but carefully constructed to seem harmless. "I'm not here to deny what happened, that'd be foolish, but I am asking for some understanding, context, you know?" He tapped his fingers lightly, as if pacing his own words. "What happened out there? It got out of hand. There's pressure on the street, politics, public expectations, tension every time we pull someone over. Still, nothing." Brent wet his lips. "I've been thinking about it, all of it. That interaction? Sure, I came in hot, but it wasn't personal. Never was. I was just doing what I thought the job demanded. Fast reads, decisive tone, keep things moving. You know how it goes." Her eyes didn't flinch. Her hands remained relaxed at her sides. Not folded, not clenched, just calm. Brent's smile faltered. "What I'm saying is, I get it now, really. I crossed a line. No excuse, but maybe there's a better way to handle this, internally, quietly, without making it a headline." He reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, pulling out a single sheet of paper, folded once. He slid it across the table, face down. "It's a statement. Drafted it myself. Says I'll take leave. Mandatory counseling. Public service outreach. I'll even do a segment on community rebuilding if that helps. We can frame it as restorative, not punitive. The public gets a resolution. The department gets stability." She said, not abruptly, not slowly, just with precision, as though the chair had been waiting only for her intent to occupy it. Her eyes moved to the paper, but didn't touch it. Brent tried again. "Look, the system's fragile right now. One wrong headline and recruitment drops. Morale crashes. People walk off the force. We both know it. This," he tapped the paper, "is a chance to prevent that." Silence. He chuckled softly, nervously. "Come on, you're not made of stone. I know you've had to work both sides of the aisle before. You're internal affairs, not internal execution. Let's not burn down the house to fix the wiring." Still nothing. Her presence was beginning to scrape at his confidence like wind against cheap paint. Every second she didn't speak made his words sound more like excuses, more like a desperate ornament than negotiation. He reached for a tone shift. "Look," he said, lowering his voice as if sincerity could now be summoned like a friend, "I know what I did looks bad. It was bad, but I'm not the only one. I'm just the one who got caught in the worst possible way. That has to count for something, right?" She blinked. It was the first movement she'd made since sitting, and it was colder than a slap. Brent swallowed hard. "I've got a family," he added, voice thinning at the edges. "Kids, a mortgage. I've given my life to this job. Don't let that be wasted because I made one public mistake." The paper remained untouched. His hands clenched, then relaxed, then clenched again. She finally looked at him, not through him, not around him, but directly, and when she did, it was with the weight of an entire system behind her silence. Brent shifted again, the silence now burning like a spotlight he couldn't step out of. His hands, once confidently resting on the table, began to fidget, thumb rubbing over knuckle, ring finger tapping against skin. His voice returned, softened but cracked with tension. "I know how this looks, all right. From the outside, it's brutal. But you, of all people, you know how fast things spiral. One misunderstanding and boom, your entire life's work can get reduced to a meme." Still, she said nothing. Brent exhaled sharply, then leaned in, lowering his voice into something he thought sounded intimate, confessional. "This job, it breaks people, and I've seen it happen. Hell, I've felt it. You spend enough years behind the badge and it stops being armor. It becomes a weight. You forget how to talk to people. You forget how to be human. But I can fix this. I'm asking for a shot to fix it." Her gaze didn't soften, It didn't blink. It didn't buy a single syllable. He licked his lips, eyes searching hers for something: sympathy, weakness, recognition, anything. "I have 2 daughters," he added, more desperate now, 6 and 8. "You think they deserve to watch their dad get shredded online? Think about them, not me, them." "Nothing." Brent's fingers curled inward. His voice sharpened, not in strength, but in panic. "What is this to you, huh? Some ritual? A quiet execution while pretending it's fair? You sit there like a ghost, and I'm the one bleeding out." She finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her coat pocket and placed a small black device on the table. It was rectangular, discreet, and blinking red. Brent stared at it. "You've been recording this?" His voice cracked in disbelief, horror blooming beneath his skin. She didn't nod. She didn't smirk. She simply pressed a button. A second later, a speaker on the side of the device hissed, then began to play back his voice from moments earlier. "I'm not here to deny what happened. I just think we can handle this inside, quietly, for the good of the department." His words, his tone, his bargain. The room didn't echo anymore. It carved. "What the hell is this?" he asked, though the answer had already wrapped itself around his throat. He reached the center of the table and placed a second object down. A tablet screen, still dark. Then, with a flick of her fingertip, it came to life. On it, a real-time feed. A live broadcast. A digital audience of silent observers. Badges, lawyers, oversight officials. All watching. "You're broadcasting this?" Brent checked. "Now," she spoke finally, her voice as crisp and sharp as cut glass. "Not broadcasting. Submitting. This is part of the record." His face drained. She leaned slightly forward. "You asked for this conversation. You framed it as private. And yet every word you've chosen has reinforced the culture you claim to regret." Brent opened his mouth to respond. Nothing came out. She continued, steady as a gavel. "You wanted to cut a deal. Not because you're sorry, but because you're exposed. You didn't ask how to make things right. You asked how to make them disappear." The camera on the tablet glinted back at him, a quiet jury of glass and code. Brent's hands dropped to his lap, useless. His face paled, slackened. He had come in thinking he still had cards to play. But there were no cards, no table, just the echo of his voice, caught, catalogued, and submitted into history. The silence that returned after her words was different. It wasn't the blank, passive quiet Brent had used as space to plead, nor the indifference he had mistaken for mercy. This was an accusatory silence, one that grew teeth the longer it lingered. He stared at the screen, now populated with rows of thumbnails, observers with muted microphones and sharp eyes, a digital jury he hadn't consented to face. Brent leaned back, more from necessity than intent, his breath uneven. "This isn't due process," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's an ambush. Theater." She didn't reply. She didn't have to. The playback continued on the speaker. His voice, pitching and adjusting, trying to find a foothold in manipulation. Each word was a match lit against the paper-thin integrity he had left. "You have no right," he said suddenly, louder. "Private conversation. You didn't disclose. This wasn't recorded with consent." She tapped the screen gently, almost as a punctuation mark. "Code 74B of Federal Internal Review Protocols," she said, her voice still perfectly even. "Any verbal exchange between a subject under review and an authorized agent may be documented for review without notification if the content may contribute to determining intent, accountability, or violation of ethics." Brent's jaw locked. She had come prepared not just with power, but with statute. "This is a witch hunt," he barked. "A takedown." "You're not important enough to be hunted," she replied, and for the first time there was something close to emotion in her voice. Not anger, not pity, precision, like someone correcting a false data point. "You just became an example, not because you're the worst, but because you were loudest when you thought no one could hear." Brent's shoulders sagged. "Why me?" She paused, not out of hesitation, but calculation. "Because your arrogance was public, and accountability, when delayed, requires a clear face." His mouth opened, then closed. His breath slowed, then caught. He realized with dawning horror that the room didn't belong to him anymore. It never had. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a submission. And the moment he'd walked into that space, thinking he could sway her, the trap had already snapped shut. She reached out once more, turning the speaker off. The silence once again reclaimed the room, but it no longer belonged to him. Monroe didn't shift in her seat, didn't allow the moment to swell into drama. She let it sit, unforgiving, exposed, real. Brant's mouth opened once more, lips fumbling for another justification, but even he could feel it. Every argument had dissolved in its echo. There were no more angles left to twist, no curtains to hide behind. The air itself felt narrower now, thinned out by the weight of what could no longer be denied. His fingers grazed the surface of the table as if seeking an anchor, something stable in a room that had quietly turned into a courtroom. "Agent Monroe," he tried again, softer now. "Look, maybe I didn't always handle things by the book. Maybe I got hardened. The job does that. You know that. You've seen it." His voice cracked, not from emotion but erosion. Decades of bluff and bluster, finally fraying where they couldn't be patched anymore. She didn't blink. "This wasn't about the book," she said, every syllable crisp. "It was about the mirror, and you refused to look." The screen behind her flickered as another window opened. Live transcription logs, an automated summary of the meeting. "Recording ended," the AI voice said. The finality of it struck harder than any shout. Brant's eyes darted toward the board's panel, where observers were now active, issuing digital instructions, protocol triggers, disciplinary chain activation. She gathered her papers slowly, methodically. No rustle, no rush. Control didn't need speed, it needed certainty, and she moved with all of it. "You'll be contacted formally," Monroe said, standing. "Until then, I suggest you speak only when advised by counsel. Anything else will just add to the weight." Brent remained seated, throat dry, eyes cast toward the floor as though trying to see backward into a past that might forgive him. But the room held none of that. There were no redemptions here, only records. She reached for the door handle, then paused. Without turning back, she added, "You wanted a private conversation. What you got was a perfect record." She stepped out, heels silent against the polished tile. Behind her, the room stayed motionless. Brent didn't rise. He didn't speak. The board, already convening, began issuing notations. His name, no longer shielded, flashed across multiple screens, now bracketed with terms he'd once used to describe others. Suspended, under formal review, pending discharge. And somewhere in the sterile silence that followed, Brent finally understood. This wasn't just exposure, it was erasure. The headlines hit like ruptured levees, flooding every outlet with a name that could no longer be hidden beneath bureaucratic sediment. Officer under federal probe, previously accused in unresolved assault case, they read, and though the words were clinical, their edges were serrated. The photo attached was unmistakable. Brent Halverson, eyes squinted, jaw set, the kind of face that once projected authority, now stripped bare under the spotlight of accountability. 5 years had passed since the original complaint. 5 years of silence, packaged as dismissal, stamped with the hollow phrase, lack of evidence. But that silence had never been neutral. It had weight, it had direction. And now it echoed. Monroe sat at her desk, the screen before her a stark contrast of white files and black ink. The folder wasn't classified. It wasn't even buried. It had simply been ignored, neglected in plain sight. Inside, a timeline of neglect, a sketch of the victim's face, fragile lines capturing trauma that no photograph ever had. Her fingers hovered over the image, then shifted through the incident logs, internal memos, and redacted emails with subject lines that read sensitive and resolved but told another story entirely. The victim's name? Janelle Carter, a nursing student at the time, no priors, no record, just the wrong presence in the wrong place. according to Brent's original report. Monroe leaned back, letting the room blur as her mind assembled the silent pieces. The attack had taken place on a summer evening outside a closed gas station. Janelle had claimed Brent accused her of loitering, then escalated to physical force when she questioned his intent. The bruises were photographed, her statement filed, but the investigation withered within weeks. The file closed without follow-up. Internal Affairs never called. Until now. She picked up the desk phone, not her mobile, and dialed the last known number listed for Janelle. It rang out. Voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. A third time. Then a fourth. On the fifth, a voice finally answered, older than the case file, raspier, cautious. "Hello? Janelle Carter?" Monroe asked. Tone neutral, calibrated. "Who's asking?" "My name is Agent Monroe. I'm with Internal Affairs, Federal Division. I'm reviewing an incident involving Brent Halverson, the one from 2019. A long silence, not static, breathing. "I'm not interested in testifying," Janelle said finally, her voice trembling. "I'm not asking you to testify," Monroe said. "I just need to ask you about the truth." Another silence. Then, "Why now?" Monroe paused, allowing the question to settle between them. "Because he finally ran out of places to hide." There was a sound then, something between a sob and a laugh, and then, as if a dam cracked just enough to let pain trickle through, Janelle spoke again. "I thought no one gave a damn. I told myself it didn't matter anymore, but it did. It does." Monroe closed her eyes for a second, grounding the moment. "I have a copy of your original statement, and the sketch. It's intact." There was a gasp. You still have it?" "Yes. We never throw truth away," Monroe said. The conversation didn't unravel. It peeled, slow and deliberate, layer after layer of silence finally giving way to memory. Monroe sat at her desk, headset on, eyes locked to the screen as Janelle's voice came through, steadier now, though still bruised around the edges. "I was walking home. Just walking," Janelle said, her breath hitching. "I'd missed the last bus, and the gas station was the only place with light. He pulled up, asked what I was doing there. I told him I was just resting for a minute. He said I looked suspicious." Monroe typed, each keystroke methodical, capturing fact, not opinion. "Did he identify himself?" "No badge, just the uniform. He kept his hand near his belt the whole time." "Did he tell you he was detaining you?" Janelle scoffed, bitter. "He didn't say it. He just did it. Grabbed my wrist. Told me I was testing boundaries." I still remember those words. Monroe noted the phrase. Familiar. Brent's trademark rhetoric. Vague. Accusatory. Self-justifying. "He pushed me against the side of the building. Said I matched a description, but there were no suspects. No alerts. Nothing. He just wanted to make a point." Janelle's voice was tight now, compacted rage beneath cold ash. Monroe didn't interrupt. "I filed a report. Internal Affairs from the precinct said there wasn't enough to pursue it. Said my bruises weren't conclusive." "Did you keep the medical records?" Monroe asked. "Yes. I emailed them 3 times. Got one reply. Said received. That was it." A pause. Then, quieter. "I stopped checking after a while." Monroe stopped typing. "Can you forward them to me again?" "Yes." The line stayed open, both women breathing into the static. Monroe didn't press further. Testimony wasn't extracted. It had to be offered. And Janelle, in that breath of shared resolve, gave one more piece. "I still have the shirt I wore that night. It has a tear from where he grabbed me. Send it," Monroe said. "We test everything now. This time, it counts." Janelle let out a long breath, not relief, but the first exhale that didn't feel like surrender. The moment the call ended, Monroe slid the digital recording into a secure folder, time-stamped and encrypted, then opened a blank investigation canvas. The screen expanded into a grid, columns labeled Incident, Date, Location, Comlant Type, Key Language, Outcome. She pulled Janelle's case into the first row, dragging in the audio, the victim statement, and the incomplete precinct logs from 5 years ago. Then, She began digging. Names came first. She cross-checked the officer deployment records and saw Brent Halverson's signature 3 times on reports logged within a 2-mile radius of Janelle's incident that same month. One was marked routine patrol, another suspicious person, and the last verbal warning issued no further action. All carried his penmanship. All had no accompanying body cam footage. Monroe frowned. Too clean. Next came language patterns. She searched for phrases, testing boundaries, matched a description, and non-compliant behavior. Brent had used all 3 in recent reports as well. He had recycled justification like a broken loop of impunity, dressing up bias in legalese. Monroe flagged each occurrence, attaching Janelle's testimony as a parallel. She pulled a half-dozen older misconduct logs, cases closed without follow-up, and saw the same fingerprints, same cold phrasing, same erasures, same excuses. Officer discretion, no conclusive evidence, deemed low priority. Every dismissal felt like a brick in the wall he'd built around himself. But now, that wall had fissures. Monroe leaned in, opening archived footage from an old precinct hearing where Brent's behavior was questioned in a separate matter. Off mic, someone had muttered, "He's got a way of staying just under the radar." She clipped that too. Not evidence in court, but a pulse check on how long the silence had enabled him. Her phone buzzed. An internal message from data forensics. They'd started syncing timestamps from Brent's logged patrols and surveillance nodes from third-party businesses in the area during Janelle's case. A convenience store's backup drive had been recovered. Low resolution, but clear enough to show a patrol car stopping by a gas station at the precise time she mentioned. The footage hadn't been pulled before. No one had asked. She stared at the screen. There he was, Brent, standing outside the driver's side door, arms crossed, then leaning toward a woman whose face was turned away from the lens. No physical contact was caught, but proximity confirmed. She logged the angle, noted his posture. Arrogant, aggressive, familiar. A knock at her door. One of the review officers entered, holding a printed report. "You're gonna want this," he said, laying it down. "It's Brent's precinct communication logs. From 5 years back." Monroe skimmed it. Buried in the data was a radio call at the same hour as Janelle's assault. Brent had reported in with the vague, possible loitering, investigating. No citation issued. No incident report filed. The paper trail had always been just enough to look like work, never enough to show the harm. She tapped her screen, connecting one more node to the growing map, and just like that, a story emerged. Not of a single act, but of a systemic failure wrapped in the habits of one man, repeated until no one thought to question the silence anymore. The case file Monroe had reconstructed sat heavy in her digital outbox, a mosaic of documents, testimonies, cross-referenced timestamps, and unedited surveillance, each file a fracture in the thin blue wall. At exactly 9:00, IEMing, she pressed send. The encrypted packet shot through the agency's secure channel to the Office of Federal Oversight. Within minutes, acknowledgement pinged back. The wheel had turned. Elsewhere, the storm Monroe had quietly orchestrated began to erupt into the public sphere. A whistleblower forum leaked an internal summary outlining the reopened investigation tied to an unresolved use-of-force incident involving a protected demographic. The name Brent Halverson wasn't redacted well enough. Within hours, investigative journalists were combing precinct rosters, correlating archived police statements with public record. The headline came fast. Federal review tied to previously dismissed officer misconduct case. The media didn't editorialize. They didn't need to. The facts spoke with the blunt force of truth. Janelle's name appeared, only her first, attached to an old closed file with the note, "Insufficient evidence, closed command." That closure was now open again, and the stain it carried had seeped beyond the man, into the precinct, into the system that had chosen convenience over justice. Monroe didn't speak to the cameras. She didn't need to. Her job wasn't to be quoted. It was to be accurate, and accurate she was. News clips ran split screen. Brent walking a line of reporters, face blank, lips pressed in a calculated frown. He gave no statements. Behind him, camera zooms caught the tremble in his hand as he reached for the precinct door. Inside, someone had painted over his nameplate already. When the federal response followed swiftly, the Office of Oversight issued a statement confirming ongoing review of procedural failures linked to dismissed use-of-force reports and promised a renewed focus on latent misconduct. They didn't name names, but they didn't have to. Online, the story had found legs. Activist forums compared Brent's phrasing in his past reports to dozens of other cases across 3 states. Language analysis bots picked out phrases repeated like dogma, non-compliant tone, unsure purpose of loitering. Subject exhibited attitude. Each phrase, when isolated, seemed harmless. Together, they painted an algorithm of abuse. Brent's reports weren't one-offs. They were code, and Monroe had cracked it. By week's end, the Janelle case had been reopened under federal jurisdiction. Monroe received an email with a simple subject line: transfer of lead, Janelle D. Case Monroe Protect. No fanfare. No commentary, just the baton, passed quietly to the one person who refused to let it drop. Meanwhile, Janelle's lawyer issued a statement confirming her cooperation with federal investigators. She wouldn't speak publicly, but her presence was no longer shadowed. The silence that once muted her story had been shattered, not with outrage, but with record-keeping. Time-stamped accountability, and a paper trail sharp enough to slice through denial. In precinct break rooms, Brent's name was no longer spoken. Officers now joked in hushed tones about Monroe's reach, as if it were legend. Some feared her, others respected her. All understood her power, not to intimidate, but to prove. The email from federal oversight had been sent at dawn, but by the time the precinct lights flickered on, its ripple had turned to rupture. No alarms rang out, no sirens wailed, and yet the silence was violent. A dozen resignations landed like stone drops into still water, concentric waves rippling across desks and bulletin boards. Uniforms were folded neatly on top of lockers, name tags left askew beside emptied drawers, and chairs pushed back from desks in an eerie choreography of quiet flight. The first to fall was Captain Irwin Maddox, Brent's direct superior, the one whose signature had once quietly shelved complaints and scrubbed violations from files with bureaucratic precision. His letter was one line: "I have failed to uphold the standard I once swore to protect. No justification, no plea, just the last gasp of a man who saw the tide shift and chose not to drown fighting it." By mid-morning, 5 more had followed. A few claimed personal leave, others early retirement, and some did not explain at all, but the meaning was clear, unmistakable in its weight. The fortress wasn't being stormed. It was collapsing from within. Monroe didn't attend their exit. She didn't need to. Her silence echoed louder than any farewell. At precisely 2:00 p.m., she stepped into a closed-door meeting with the department's Internal Affairs Unit, federal liaisons, and senior command staff. The room was beige and sterile, the kind designed to sterilize conflict. Still, tension hung in the recycled air like static waiting for a spark. She opened the door, and something shifted. One by one, the officers in the room stood. No protocol demanded it, no superior had ordered it. They simply stood, some with heads lowered, some with eyes locked on hers, but all acknowledging something far older than rank. Not obedience, not fear, respect. Monroe paused at the threshold, her gaze scanning the room like a cold wind. She carried no folder, no badge raised, no gestures of command. She didn't need them. Her presence alone was the verdict. Every corner of the institution that had been ignored, covered, or excused was now staring, at the woman who refused to blink. The oldest among them, Lieutenant Ross, cleared his throat. His voice was low, lined with fatigue and something almost like reverence. "Not because of rank," he said quietly, "because you did what we wouldn't." She didn't answer, didn't nod, just walked to the chair at the head of the table and sat. The sound of her chair meeting the floor was louder than any gavel. Around her, the silence wasn't idle. It was studious, reverent, and trembling with consequence. Each officer remained on their feet for a moment longer, unsure whether to reclaim their seats or remain standing, as if sitting too soon might fracture something sacred. Monroe didn't speak. She simply reached for the stack of documents already placed before her. Records, timestamps, resignation notices, a printed summary of the oversight directive, and flipped them over, one by one, with the same quiet authority she had wielded from the very beginning. The gesture was not administrative, it was forensic. On the page, the truth lay naked. Repeated patterns of internal omissions, hastily filed waivers, peer-to-peer shielding, all executed in plain sight and protected by an unspoken pact of complicity. The institution had not just failed to hold Brent accountable, it had conspired, actively and passively, to keep him, and others like him, untouched. Lieutenant Ross, whose voice had first broken the air, was now seated beside her. His hands were clasped, fingers locked like a man praying. "This place is cracking," he said. "I thought if I held still enough, it'd pass." Monroe's eyes didn't move from the page. "It passed," she said, not cruelly, but with the finality of a drawn curtain. "You just didn't." No one defended him. No one spoke to justify the blindfolds they'd worn for years. The room, for all its years of echoing rationalizations and internal apologies, had nothing left to offer but stillness. That, and the sound of their breathing, slow, almost ashamed. Another file slid across the table. Monroe's fingers paused at the corner, eyes narrowing on the seal embossed on its cover. It wasn't part of her packet. She looked up. Major Gillian, a 30-year veteran and acting command lead since Brandt's formal suspension, gave a curt nod. "I signed that this morning. My notice. Effective immediately." Why? It was the only word Monroe gave him. Gillian's eyes, storm-colored and steady, didn't blink. "Because I remembered what my badge used to mean to me, and what I let it become." Monroe gave no reply, only opening the folder. His letter was handwritten. No flourishes, just ink and remorse. Beside him, Sergeant Voss slid her folder forward, then another. Like dominoes folding into one another, half the table pushed forward envelopes, some trembling, some defiant. The sound of paper scraping across wood became the strange new anthem of reckoning. And yet, Monroe didn't smile, didn't gloat. She received each envelope like a coroner, cataloging the last belongings of the dead, because that's what these were. Confessions, last words, silent obituaries of careers, built on silence, now undone by the presence of a woman who had simply refused to look away. For a long stretch, nothing else moved. The air was thick, but no one reached for water. Eyes met eyes, then looked away. The hierarchy that once ruled the room had dissolved, not in chaos, but in solemn equality. They were no longer commanders, lieutenants, or captains. They were witnesses. They were those who had looked the other way and now had nowhere left to turn. Monroe adjusted her pen atop the folder. It was the smallest gesture, yet in that room it might as well have been thunder. Across from her, Ross looked as though he wanted to say something. She met his eyes and he reconsidered. Instead, he nodded once, deeply, as if confessing not just guilt, but gratitude for being allowed to surrender it. In that silence, Monroe pulled the final document from her briefcase. It was a memorandum, short, blunt, addressed to the Department of Justice. She slid it to the center of the table, rotated it so they could read it, and folded her hands. "This," she said, "is a recommendation for a systemic audit." No one asked for clarification. They didn't need it. The Department of Justice would now have cause, backed by internal testimony and voluntary resignation, to initiate a full investigatory review. Every desk, every drawer, every back-channel email. What began as a single stop in a sunny plaza had now cracked the foundation beneath a whole precinct, not because Monroe had chased it, but because once the silence broke, the system collapsed under the weight of its secrets. Ross leaned forward and placed his badge on the table. Not his resignation, just the badge. "I don't want to leave," he said. "But if staying means returning to what it was before, then I'll follow the rest." Monroe looked down at the badge. Her fingers didn't move. "Then don't return," she said. "Rebuild." The room didn't clap. It didn't need to. What moved was quieter. A few breaths released, a few shoulders lowered, a few eyes, perhaps for the first time, looked straight ahead without fear of being seen. Outside, the late morning sun had begun to shift through the blinds. The light fell across the resignation letters, gilding the ink like inscriptions on stone. Monroe stood, slowly. No one moved until she reached the door. Then, as if drawn by a pulse older than any uniform, every officer stood again, not out of habit, out of choice, out of recognition, out of change. The door closed behind Monroe with a soft hydraulic hiss, leaving behind the hushed room of standing officers, and sealing in the legacy of a moment that would echo far beyond the precinct walls. But it didn't end there. 1,000 miles away, in a cold, windowless office carved into the stone heart of a federal building, another room was being prepared. Clean lines, polished surfaces, recessed lighting designed not for warmth but for focus. Above the glass conference table, a plaque had just been mounted. Simple, stainless steel, engraved with only 2 words, Monroe Protocol. No fanfare had accompanied the naming. No ceremony, just an internal memo circulated that morning, stating that all sensitive misconduct cases, flagged as high risk or previously dismissed under questionable grounds, were now to undergo review under the Monroe Protocol system, an initiative rooted in the idea that silence, when wielded with precision, could become not absence, but presence, not void, but a verdict. The room itself became a symbol. There were no portraits, no flags, just walls of frosted glass that looked both inward and outward, just like the process Monroe had championed. Transparency with boundaries, oversight with teeth, power that neither shouted nor pleaded, but simply watched. Inside the newly designated room, a young investigator sat reviewing the first case file slated for the protocol. His hands moved over the documents with quiet care. Names, dates, statements that once sank into bureaucracy are now floating back to the surface, marked urgent. He was 26, freshly assigned from a rotation in field compliance, and though he had never met Monroe in any official capacity, her presence filled the room like pressure in the air before a storm. When she entered, unannounced, unguarded, he stood immediately, not from protocol, but respect. The silence between them was not awkward, it was reverent. "You're the one assigned to pilot review A47, she said, her voice even but edged with the kind of gravity that made posture straighten on instinct. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Started this morning." She walked to the far side of the table and placed a single folder down. "This one hasn't been flagged yet." "It should be." He took it, opened it to the summary page. "How far back does it go?" Monroe's eyes didn't blink. 17 years. He looked at the date, then up at her. "Why now? Because no one else did?" she replied. Her tone wasn't dramatic, it wasn't bitter, it was the sound of a woman who had outlived every excuse. There was a pause, then he said, "They named the room after you." Monroe's gaze swept across the ceiling, then back to the case file in his hands. "They can name rooms whatever they want. Just make sure what happens inside them means something." He nodded. Something inside him shifted, not in awe, but in alignment. "You took silence," he said softly, "and made it speak." She didn't reply. She didn't need to, but for the first time her expression eased. Her jaw unclenched, the line between her brows disappeared. She saw in him something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for. Not a replacement, continuance. He looked down at the folder again, thumbing through the yellowed records with a reverence that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with weight. Monroe stepped behind him, glancing at the details from over his shoulder. An internal affairs complaint from nearly 2 decades ago. A name that had stopped appearing in any recent departmental correspondence. A signature that had vanished into institutional forgetfulness. "You'll find a memo in there from Chief Renner," she said, signed, then unsent. It was buried behind 3 unrelated training reports. Intentional misfiling. He nodded, absorbing each word like code. The kind you don't repeat out loud, but carry forward in your bloodstream. "Did you ever confront him?" he asked. Monroe didn't hesitate. "No need. Systems expose cowards better than arguments do." He tilted his head, considering that. "That's what you believe in?" She turned to the wall of glass facing the hallway, where 2 agents passed by without looking in. "I believe in truth. Systems are just what we build to carry them, if we build them right." The room's silence returned, not oppressive, but alive. It held a pulse now, the kind that lives only in places where conviction meets power. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "Why did you stay?" It wasn't a question meant to challenge, it was naked curiosity, tinged with awe, edged with longing for an answer he could use as his compass. Monroe's answer came after a beat of thought, slow and deliberate. Because someone had to witness the long defeat. Someone had to make sure it wasn't also a quiet one. Outside the glass, someone tapped a badge against the security reader. A beep. A door opened. Closed. Business as usual. But inside, the young agent straightened again. His spine recalibrated. His shoulders reset. He had come in thinking he was part of a new team. He realized now he was part of a legacy, not because he bore her name, but because the work before him demanded the same kind of resolve. "I won't waste this room," he said. Monroe gave a quiet nod, then turned to leave. As she did, her reflection caught in the glass. 2 people, one in motion, one anchored to a desk, now holding truth that couldn't be ignored. And in that reflection, the system no longer looked like a monolith. It looked like a mirror. The hallway outside the Monroe Protocol room hummed with its usual undercurrent of footsteps, clipped conversations, and the muted rhythm of badge scanners pinging authorization. Yet something intangible had shifted since the room's christening. Staff members passed it with more awareness, as if proximity to its glass walls demanded a moment of personal audit. Even those uninvolved in internal affairs spoke of it with a gravity reserved for sacred spaces. The space had become both relic and reckoning. Monroe moved quietly through that hallway, not searching for acknowledgement, but leaving ripples in her wake regardless. From a conference room 3 doors down, an aide whispered to another, "That's her." The whisper was not gossip nor awe. It was confirmation, like finally seeing the gravity well you'd only read about in theory. At her desk, Monroe found a packet waiting, not from the Justice Department, but from someone unsigned, folded inside a manila envelope. No memo header, no printed date, just a single image. A child's drawing, stick figures in blue crayon, one smaller than the other, holding hands. Below them, in barely legible cursive, the words, "Thank you for making grown-ups do the right thing." She stared at the paper for a long moment, then folded it once and slid it into her coat pocket like evidence of something that could not be logged but mattered more than most things that were. Across the building, new agents entered the protocol room with assignments that now bore a seal in the upper right corner, a stylized M etched into a circular band. The Monroe Protocol wasn't just a name anymore. It was a standard, one whose weight pressed on every report, every decision, every silence. One junior agent, assigned to a sensitive use of force review, hesitated outside the door. His hand trembled slightly before it met the scanner. The door clicked. He stepped inside. The room greeted him not with warmth, but clarity. That was its power. It didn't comfort, it didn't distract, it reminded. And above the large monitor, right where an institutional logo used to hang, was a line now engraved in brushed steel. "Justice is not what we say, it's what we verify." The agent looked up at those words as he pulled the first file toward him. His breath steadied, and then he began to read. Outside the protocols and procedures, away from transcripts and hearings, Monroe sat alone in the small cafeteria after hours. Her tray remained untouched, a modest cup of black coffee cooling in silence. The television mounted on the wall replayed a news segment about the Monroe Protocol's swift impact. Anchors spoke with reverence, but she tuned them out. Her focus was internal, not external. The cost of every step she'd taken weighed more now, not less. That, too, was a kind of justice. In the reflection of the glass window before her, Monroe saw the glow of headlines she never asked for. But what she also saw was her posture, upright, unshaken, not triumphant, just steady. And in that stillness, something unspoken took root. Legacy is not built on noise. It's built on what survives the silence. Later that evening, a letter arrived from the Inspector General's office. The tone was formal, the content factual, acknowledgement of her role in initiating systemic corrections. Yet at the bottom, someone had handwritten in ink. The system blinked. You didn't. Monroe traced the words once with her finger, then filed the letter, not under accomplishments, but in the drawer labeled ongoing. As days passed, the Monroe Protocol triggered more oversight requests. The backlog of ignored complaints shrank. Departments previously resistant to transparency began submitting voluntary compliance updates. No one called her. No one thanked her directly. They didn't need to. The movement was in motion. And amid it all, Monroe remained in the same modest office, taking the same train, wearing the same calm. She'd never raised her voice in a hearing, never shouted down an injustice. But when she walked into a room, the air adjusted. People spoke with more precision. Their eyes lifted quicker. No memo could explain it. It was just something that felt. When asked in a closed-door interview how she felt about a room being named after her, Monroe had simply replied, "I don't work for my name. I work so that fewer names get buried." In the end, that was the room's quiet oath. Every wall inside it echoed the same principle, not hers, but one she'd revived through action. That silence, when chosen wisely, is louder than any defense. Those records, when kept truthfully, speak louder than any speech. That justice, once awakened, does not retreat. It expands. The room had changed, but her posture had not. From the Monroe Protocol to Capitol Hill, Monroe moved like a metronome set to quiet defiance, never flinching, never rushing. The congressional chamber buzzed with prelude, rustling papers, shifting suits, cameras adjusting their lenses. She took her seat at the hearing table without a glance toward the gallery. Her presence alone brought a hush that not even the gavel could summon. A placard labeled her Federal Oversight Liaison, but everyone in the room already knew her by a different title, the woman who made the system look in the mirror. The chairman cleared his throat, an audible signal that the performance was about to begin. "Ms. Monroe," he said, voice rehearsed but respectful, "in your opinion, what is the single greatest barrier to reforming law enforcement in this country?" No preamble, no page flipping. Monroe didn't even shift in her seat. She simply said, "Silence." The word landed like a hammer with no sound, its weight not in its volume but in the reverberation it left behind. A silence not of absence, but of indictment. She did not elaborate. She did not blink. She did not look around the room to measure her impact. Instead, she calmly rose from her chair, gave a nod to the committee, and stepped down from the podium. Her heels tapped against the floor once, twice, 3 times, then vanished down the carpeted aisle like punctuation at the end of a sentence that needed no editing. The chairwoman of the committee, caught momentarily off guard, leaned into her mic and addressed the room with what felt like a breath held too long. "We've just witnessed the shortest and perhaps the clearest testimony this year." Around her, the chamber remained still, transfixed not by drama, but by the raw assertion that silence, not bureaucracy, not funding, not even corruption, was the most dangerous infection. Outside the building, reporters swarmed, but were met only by the echo of her absence. There were no prepared statements, no press releases, no retweets. Monroe had said all that needed saying, and in the days that followed, think pieces sprouted like weeds. Analysts dissected that single word from every angle, but none could refute its implication, that systems don't rot from noise, they rot from silence, cultivated over decades and sold as decorum. And through it all, Monroe remained silent still, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had already said everything. The word silence had barely settled in the airwaves when Brent Halverson reemerged in the public eye, not through testimony, not through accountability, but through print, an op-ed buried in the back pages of the city's most conservative newspaper. The headline tried to scream redemption, a letter of growth, my path forward. It was a monument to euphemism, built with bricks of self-pity and mortar made from passive voice. He wrote, "I've grown from this," as if maturity had been gifted to him by exposure, rather than wrestled with through consequence. He claimed, "I acted under the intense pressures of my environment," as if racism were a weather system he had simply gotten caught in without an umbrella. His paragraphs stretched with elaborate guilt that circled itself without ever landing on a name, without ever placing himself directly in the line of fire his actions had triggered. When the editorial reached Monroe's desk, someone had slid it under her door like a prank. She didn't sit down to read it. She stood, unfolded it with fingers steady as verdicts, and let her eyes glide across each curated syllable. She didn't blink at the words misunderstood intentions or the phrase pain caused unintentionally. She didn't smile at the hope of doing better. What she did, after reaching the last line, was fold the letter once, twice, and tear it in half, not out of anger, but out of rejection. Then, like a surgeon preparing a suture that would not be seen but always felt, she penned a response on federal stationery with handwriting precise enough to draw blood. The note read, "You didn't grow. You just got caught. Sign the disciplinary record, not the speechwriter's draft." Her assistant hand-delivered the note in the 2 paper halves back to Brent's temporary office, a room stripped of insignia where even the coat rack looked like it wanted to disassociate. He read it, alone, no audience, no applause, just the dry sound of rejection folding him in. He tried to laugh once, bitterly, but the sound stuck to the inside of his throat like a truth half swallowed and too jagged to ignore. The press, of course, did what it does. They ran both pieces, his and hers, side by side. Readers didn't even need headlines to know which voice was which. One was padded in abstractions, the other sliced through pretense like glass. Letters to the editor flooded in, calling Brent's apology hollow, performative, and theatrical. One commentator noted, "What Mr. Halverson offered wasn't accountability. It was a linguistic hostage negotiation with shame." Monroe, true to form, issued no follow-up. Her one sentence lived longer than Brent's entire letter. It was posted on office bulletin boards, screen-printed on protest signs, whispered in conference hallways like a parable, and Brent, cornered by the aftermath of his evasions, had no rebuttal. The silence he once used as a tool to intimidate had now become the echo chamber of his fall. In one office, far from cameras and applause, a junior agent stapled Monroe's note to Brent's disciplinary file. It sat there like a signature forged in steel, marking the permanent failure of a man who once believed power meant never having to say anything real. Brent Halverson sat in the administrative hearing room with a stiffness that could not be straightened by posture alone. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, now hung on him like a reminder of misused privilege. The insignia on his sleeve had not been stripped, but it might as well have been invisible. His badge was suspended, his dignity crumbling. Across from him, Monroe entered, not with vengeance, but with presence. Her steps were measured, not as a march of justice, but as the embodiment of it. The room didn't stand for her. It simply went quiet, and that silence was louder than any gavel. The presiding official cleared his throat, flipping through pages he already knew by heart. "Miss Monroe, as the federal oversight witness in this case, we ask for your sworn testimony." She nodded once. No papers in her hands, no notes to recite, just memory and principle. "I witnessed Officer Brent Halverson use his position not to protect, but to dominate. I heard his words. I saw his actions. And I stand here not because of what I felt, but because of what he did." Brent shifted in his chair, but didn't interrupt. He had already learned what silence could do when wielded by someone stronger. A member of the board leaned in. "Miss Monroe, "Do you harbor any personal animosity toward Mr. Halverson?" A pause. She didn't blink. "No," she said. "I do not hate him. I hate what happens when a uniform is worn without understanding what it's meant to stand for. I hate that silence becomes standard, that oversight becomes optional, that misconduct becomes invisible until someone bleeds, or until someone refuses to look away." The words were not shouted, but they struck like verdicts. She wasn't asking for punishment. She was naming the disease. The room didn't breathe for a moment. Even Brent, whose arrogance had once filled entire intersections, looked down, not with shame, but with the void that comes when entitlement is finally met with consequence. Monroe stepped back. "I'm not here to strip him of honor. I'm here because he gave it up himself." There were no objections. There was no applause. Just the gravity of one woman's refusal to flinch. Her testimony was not emotional, but ethical, not dramatic, but devastating. And when the hearing adjourned, the only sound that remained was the echo of her truth, unapologetic, unwavering, unforgettable. The silence in the courtroom from the trial still hung in the air like a suspended cord that hadn't quite resolved, but outside, the reverberations had already begun reshaping the foundations of an entire system. The Federal Internal Affairs Council, galvanized by the trial and the public scrutiny it triggered, convened in an emergency closed-door session. The agenda was brutal in its clarity: a vote to implement unilateral federal oversight across every state police department, effective immediately. No more warnings, no more advanced audits. The decision passed with a margin so wide it rendered debate irrelevant. They called it a historic moment. Others called it overdue. But the first name in the documentation, the one burned into the header of the federal decree, was Monroe. The Monroe-led case. That was the title affixed to the policy rollout memo, a document that would ripple through precincts, break routines, shatter cover-ups, and force every cop in the state to ask themselves, who's watching now? It was no longer enough to claim compliance. Now they had to prove it, not just to their bosses, but to a new standard, one forged not in boardrooms, but in confrontation, in exposure, in truth delivered cold and live-streamed. Some departments scrambled, others resisted, but all complied because the weight of federal pressure bore down on them with the subtlety of a falling gavel. Within days, email inboxes lit up with procedural updates and compliance protocols. Officers found themselves sitting through mandatory briefings, stripped of their badges until forms were signed, cameras activated, and consent affirmed. The culture of impunity was cracking, and through those cracks, sunlight began to pour in. And somewhere, sitting alone in his dimly lit living room, Brent Halverson watched it all unfold on the evening news. No longer in uniform, no longer with a badge, just a man in a wrinkled shirt, holding a folded letter in trembling hands. It was not a summons for promotion. It was a notice from the Department of Justice, requesting his appearance as a cautionary figure in training seminars for recruits, a living artifact of corruption, a breathing warning label. His mouth was dry. The TV screen reflected off the window, catching the loose flake of an old commendation plaque now collecting dust above his fireplace. He hadn't dared to remove it, but couldn't bear to look straight at it either. The newscaster's voice was sterile, almost bored as it detailed the policy changes, but the words felt carved in granite. "Former officer Brent Halverson," the anchor intoned, "will serve as a case study in the forthcoming nationwide training module titled Power Without Accountability, Lessons from Failure." Brent flinched, not at the words, but at how neatly they fit. He had once believed his mistakes would vanish into the bureaucracy. Instead, they had been immortalized. Across town, in the newly designated Monroe Protocol Room, a projector flickered on. A young cadet, barely 23, raised his hand during a session. "Why use him?" he asked the instructor, gesturing at a slide with Brent's mugshot. The instructor's response was sharp because he thought the system would never turn on him. You should never think that. Meanwhile, Monroe herself stood in front of a frosted glass wall, inscribed with her name, etched in clean, black serif font. She didn't linger. She didn't reveal. The recognition wasn't for vanity. It was for permanence, for institutional memory. She walked past the lettering without touching it, her steps echoing in the polished corridor. Outside, reporters still hovered near government buildings, hungry for scandal but often left with silence. Monroe gave them nothing. Her power wasn't in sound bites, it was in policy, permanence, and pressure. When asked for a statement on the federal vote, her office released a single line: "Justice doesn't end with verdicts. It begins where silence ends." And Brent, now effectively a civilian ghost, found himself haunted not by prison walls, but by freedom, by the slow torture of relevance lost. His phone buzzed less each week. Former colleagues stopped returning his messages. He had become radioactive, untouchable not because of guilt, but because of visibility. No department wanted the stain. No precinct wanted the shadow. Once he had stood behind the podium. Now he filled out visitor badges in lobbies, waiting to be escorted into buildings where he no longer belonged. He was no longer feared, he was tolerated, like an expired warning label still taped to a machine, too pitiful to remove, too embarrassing to display. That was the new punishment. Not bars, not shackles, but to live on as a permanent example of what unchecked arrogance produces when it meets someone willing to outlast it. Brent wasn't dead, but his legend was. What remained was a hollow frame, animated only by memory and regret. And in the world Monroe helped shape, regret was no longer enough. He left the municipal building like a shadow, exiting its silhouette, slow, unnoticed, and stripped of purpose. The steps he once climbed daily in polished leather shoes now met the drag of tired souls without shine. The same man who once entered flanked by junior officers, hands on hips, voice louder than protocol, now exited through the side door alone. His badge was long gone. Even the decorative pin on his lapel had been quietly unscrewed. There were no waves, no nods, just a rusted bench catching dust beneath a flag that didn't sway. Brent Halverson, once feared, once obeyed, was now a civilian, not by choice, but by extraction. His exit from law enforcement hadn't been a retirement. It had been a silent revocation, a quiet deletion. As he stepped off the government grounds, no one followed. No colleague patted his back. No photographer raised a lens. Even the janitor looked away. His once prized police shoes no longer bore the department's emblem. The insignia had been sliced off, leather scuffed, soles uneven. They squeaked against the concrete like guilt on marble. The silence didn't hug him, it rejected him. No one yelled. No one spat, but everyone avoided his eyes. A barista from the coffee shop across the street, who once remembered his order, black extra hot no cream, now acted like the espresso machine needed maintenance whenever he came near. A receptionist who used to say, "Morning, Officer Halverson," now shuffled her papers with professional urgency if he approached the desk. The silence had evolved. It wasn't passive anymore. It was directive. He passed by a bus stop. A boy, no older than 7, tugged his mother's sleeve, pointing at Brent with innocent curiosity. "Mom, is that man a bad guy?" The mother didn't speak. She just looked. And that glance, that fractional nod so slight it might have been a blink, told a story deeper than any arrest report. Brent didn't flinch. He kept walking, not with pride, not with defiance, but with the steady gait of someone finally aware that his reflection would never be respected again. No viral clip had captured this walk. No camera followed his exit, because irrelevance isn't televised. It's just felt by the weight of each step. No one hears. The streets remembered him, but not fondly, not with banners or nostalgia, but with quiet, ambient suspicion. The store clerk who once greeted him now counted bills until he left. The officer on patrol crossed to the other side of the road, not as protocol, but as a refusal. In a world increasingly built on exposure, Brent had become the exact opposite of what he once desired. Seen, but not regarded. Visible, but not acknowledged. His downfall wasn't loud, it was ongoing. Each moment he breathed in public became a slow reminder that some legacies rot in silence, not in flames. At home, his mailbox was filled only with government notices, pension recalculations, and flyers addressed to the resident. The chair in his kitchen creaked more now, not from weight, but from wear. The plaques on his wall had begun to tilt slightly. He didn't fix them. Outside, the world changed. Departments reshaped. Protocols hardened. Monroe's name appeared in law books and case briefings. Brandt's name appeared in disclaimers. A name once printed in commendations now appears in the consequences section in federal training handbooks. No warrant had been issued for him. No bars awaited him. But justice had arrived anyway. Not in sirens, not in cuffs, but in the simple, unbearable truth that legacy can be revoked. Quietly, and that was how Brent Halverson, once the loudest voice in every room, vanished. Not by exile, not by death, but by the quiet refusal of a community to ever see him as worthy again. He didn't fall from power, he dissolved. The hallway lights flickered with their usual sterile indifference as Monroe walked its length one final time. The government corridors didn't applaud, they didn't cry, they just echoed your steps until you disappeared. And that was how she preferred it. No cameras, no ceremony, just silence. Earned, not demanded. She passed the Monroe protocol room without looking in, her name still etched on the glass, black letters bold and clean against the translucent paint on the street. She didn't slow down. After everything, the hearings, the indictments, the shift in doctrine and discipline, there was no farewell address, no press release, no final report stapled in triumph. Only the whiteboard, half erased from the last meeting, sat quietly at the front of the Internal Affairs office. She uncapped a marker, steady hand, no flourish. The room had begun to fill with junior analysts and agents. Unaware she was leaving. Some paused when they saw her, some didn't. In the center of the board, with one line, she signed her departure. Not with her name, not with a quote about justice or integrity, just a sentence that cut through myth and praise alike. I'm not a hero. I was just someone who didn't look away when it mattered. No flourish, no underline. She clicked the cap back on, placed the marker in its holder, and turned. Outside the room, the hallway stretched like a quiet runway. Her red dress was still sharp, still intentional, still unforgettable against the monochrome world of men in suits and walls and grayscale. She didn't wear it for effect. She wore it because it reminded her to never fade into the machinery she once confronted head-on. Footsteps behind her slowed. Some stopped. But no one called her name. She had trained them better than that. Her strength wasn't in command, it was in conviction. And conviction, when lived correctly, does not cling to credit. In another building, a headline was being written. In another town, a training module began with her name. Somewhere, a woman who had once cried on the phone now watched the news with hope. Change had been set in motion, not by thunder, but by stillness. In Monroe, she walked toward the exit, not to escape, but to make room for the next person, the next moment. The next fight is worth showing up for, because movements don't die when their symbols step aside. They evolve. She didn't glance back, not once, because legacy isn't about what you leave behind. It's about how long it keeps standing after you've gone. What you've just heard is more than a story. It's a mirror, a challenge, and a reminder that silence can either be a weapon or a wound. Every voice matters, especially yours. Take a moment to drop a comment below. Share your thoughts. Speak your truth. What part of this story hit closest to home? Have you ever stood in a moment where silence wasn't an option? Your story could be the reason someone else finds courage today. Hit that like button to show your support for this series and the message behind it. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their power. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support isn't just about numbers. It fuels this mission, keeps this channel alive, and helps bring more stories that push us to think harder, feel deeper, and act braver. Every listen, every share, every comment builds something bigger than a follower count. It builds a community of people who refuse to turn away. People like you. You are part of this. Let's fill the space beneath this video with real voices, stories from real lives. Tell me what you faced. tell me what you've seen, or just leave a few words to keep the fire burning. You'd be surprised how far a single sentence can reach. This isn't just content, it's connection, and you are a vital part of it. So speak up, hit like, subscribe, share this message, because when stories are shared, they stop being fiction, they become fuel.